The joke landed the way bad jokes always do, loud, fast, and aimed directly at the person least likely to throw something back. "What was your rank, secretary?" The table erupted. Cousins, family friends, a few people I barely knew. Laughter bouncing off the warm wood walls of a nice restaurant in downtown Huntsville while Kevin Caldwell sat back in his chair, grinning like a man who just won something. I smiled, not because it was funny, because I'd absorbed worse from people who actually mattered. Then the older man at the nearby table stopped chewing, put down his fork, turned slowly in his chair, and looked at me the way you look at someone when you're not quite sure if what you're seeing is real. He recognized me. That was the moment everything cracked open. Not Kevin's joke, not the laughter, not Tom squeezing my wrist under the table. The real beginning happened much earlier, around 7 that same morning, in a driveway in Decatur, Alabama, while I was trying to help my 73-year-old father climb into the passenger seat of my truck. "Damn knees," Dad muttered, gripping the door frame. He always said that. Never the arthritis. Never 40 years of crawling under diesel engines in Alabama heat. Just the knees, as if they'd personally betrayed him and he hadn't spent 4 decades asking them to do the impossible. "Easy," I said, keeping one hand firm under his elbow. "I've got you." He didn't answer. Accepting help was something my father treated like a minor defeat. He'd negotiate with it, tolerate it, resent it quietly, and then move on. Earl Quinn had spent his whole life being the strongest person in any room. The joints were just the latest opponent. I drove him north to Huntsville for a VA appointment. The waiting room was packed the way VA waiting rooms always are, veterans who have been places most people only read about, now comparing blood pressure medications and sleep study results and the specific indignities of artificial knees. Dad complained about the coffee, then the parking, then the fluorescent lighting. I found it oddly comforting. A man who's still fighting is a man who's still here. By the time I dropped him back home and turned toward my own house, I was already tired in the specific way that comes from loving someone whose body is slowly losing an argument with time. Tom met me at the front door. "Still on for tonight." I knew exactly what he meant. His father's 75th birthday dinner, downtown restaurant, full family turnout, and Kevin. "Maybe he'll be in a good mood," Tom offered. I looked at him long enough that he laughed at himself. "Yeah," he said, "I didn't believe it either." Kevin Caldwell was Tom's older brother, a commercial insurance salesman who treated every family gathering like a sold-out arena show and himself like the headliner. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was something more exhausting, a man who confused volume with intelligence and an audience with an argument. The worst part wasn't that he needed attention. It was that he'd built his entire personality around never being the least impressive person in a room. And for years, around our family dinner table, he'd been safe. Cotton Row was warm and candlelit when we arrived that evening. Steak and roasted garlic in the air. Tom's parents were already seated. His sister Diane, several cousins, a cluster of family friends. And Kevin, who stood the second we walked in, not out of warmth, but because he was mid-story and needed us to expand his crowd. For the first 20 minutes, things held together. Grandkids, retirement, property taxes, football, normal family noise. Then someone asked how I was enjoying life after the military. Kevin moved like a man who'd been waiting. "Retirement," he tilted his head. "You weren't old enough to retire." "I left active duty," I said. "Same difference," he waved a hand. I smiled, picked up my water glass. Tom took a measured sip of water beside me, the particular careful sip of a man who knows exactly where this road leads. "So what did you actually do in the army?" There it was, the tone of a man who wasn't asking because he was curious. He was asking the way a lawyer asks a question he already knows the answer to, except Kevin didn't know the answer. He just assumed it would be small. "Mostly flew helicopters." He blinked. "Helicopters." "Blackhawks." "Oh," he nodded dramatically, performing surprise. "So what was your rank?" I felt the table lean in slightly. "These things have gravity." "Wise." Just wondering. No, you're not. The table laughed an honest laugh, the kind that comes when someone names the thing everyone else was pretending not to notice. Kevin pointed at me, grinning. See, that's exactly what I mean. You always answer questions with questions. I learned from professionals. More laughter. Kevin took a long sip of beer. Then the shot. What was your rank, secretary? The table exploded, not everyone but enough. A cousin slapped his cane. A family friend nearly choked. Kevin looked deeply, genuinely satisfied. Tom set his fork down with the particular careful precision of someone suppressing an entire response. Kevin's. I touched Tom's wrist, let him have it. Because here's the truth about people who need to feel big. You give them nothing, they've got nothing. I'd spent time around people who could end careers with a sentence. Kevin Caldwell was not those people. I smiled, not the polite one, not the survival one, something easier than both, and said the first thing that came into my head. People usually stood when I walked into a room. The laughter doubled. Kevin slapped the table delightedly. A cousin shook her head. Tom looked like he wasn't sure whether to be proud or nervous. I reached for my bread and let the moment pass. A server across the room dropped a full tray. Plates shattered across the floor. Several people flinched. Without thinking, I turned and said, calmly, clearly, the way you say things when staying calm is a skill you've spent years building. Easy, breathe first, then move. The young server froze for exactly 1 second, then took a breath, then started picking up pieces. When I turned back to the table, something had changed. An older man at a table nearby wasn't watching the server anymore. He was watching me, not casually, not the polite glance of someone who'd overheard a joke. He was watching me the way you watch someone when you're trying to locate a memory, when you're certain you've seen something before, and your mind is flipping through files trying to confirm it. His wife, silver-haired and graceful, said something to him. He didn't respond. He pushed his chair back. Kevin noticed before the rest of the table did. His grin dissolved. The man stood, straight-backed, deliberate, the kind of posture that doesn't come from a gym. It comes from 30 years of standing in rooms where posture communicated rank before a single word was spoken. He walked toward us slowly, stopped beside our table, and looked directly at me. Then, quietly, with the certainty of a man who never wastes a word. Havoc. Every muscle in my body went rigid. Nobody at that table understood what had just happened. Tom looked confused. Kevin looked uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name. The cousins looked at each other. I understood. Because standing next to our dinner table, in a nice restaurant in downtown Huntsville, was retired Lieutenant General Frank Holloway. And he just said the only word I'd spent years hoping no one would say in public. My callsign didn't belong in this restaurant. It belonged to dust and darkness and radios breaking apart in a sandstorm. It belonged to a version of me that existed before Tom, before this house, before my father's knees started losing their argument with gravity. I had packed that name away so carefully, for so long, I'd almost convinced myself it was gone. It wasn't gone, it was just waiting. Are you still using it? Holloway asked quietly. The restaurant noise seemed to be coming from somewhere much farther away. Kevin cleared his throat. Wait, you two know each other. Holloway's eyes hadn't moved from mine. We crossed paths. The understatement of an entire military career delivered in 4 words. Tom leaned slightly toward me. Maris. I could hear everything he wasn't saying. Who is this man? Why is he looking at you like that? Why do you suddenly look like someone just opened a door you've kept locked for 15 years? I made myself breathe. General Holloway. He nodded once. Then, with no performance and no decoration, he said, Ma'am. The word landed like a stone dropping into still water. Not loud, not showy, just unmistakably real. Kevin blinked, tried to recover. General Holloway glanced at him briefly. The glance of a man who has evaluated far more dangerous things than Kevin Caldwell and found them manageable. Diane had her fork suspended halfway between her plate and her mouth. My mother-in-law looked like she'd spent 10 years sitting next to someone at church and had just discovered they'd been the organist at Carnegie Hall the whole time. Tom's father, a retired school principal, a man who understood authority in his bones, sat very still. Holloway looked back at me. Something in his expression said I'm sorry for interrupting, and I'm not sorry simultaneously. Good to see you, Colonel Quinn. He returned to his seat. I looked down at my napkin. Colonels. Not one person at that table laughed. Kevin's mouth opened, closed. You said you flew helicopters. I did. You didn't say you were a colonel. Tom quietly, without looking up. You didn't ask with any respect. A cousin coughed into a napkin. Kevin's ears went red. The birthday dinner found its legs again, slowly, awkwardly, like an animal learning to walk, but the room had changed. Side glances. Careful questions. The particular energy of people who have just discovered that someone thou. GHT, they understood, was operating on an entirely different level than they'd assumed. I felt the questions gathering. What's havoc? Why did he say ma'am like that? Why didn't you ever tell us? That last one stung the most. Not because it was unfair, because it was reasonable. And my answer, because I didn't want to become the story, sounded hollow even inside my own head. Tom drove home with both hands on the wheel and said nothing until we were clear of Memorial Parkway. Were you going to tell me about the callsign? You knew I had one. I knew pilots had callsigns. I didn't know yours made retired 3-star generals stand up in restaurants. Outside the window, strip malls slid past. A pharmacy, a barbecue place, a church sign advertising Wednesday Bible study, the exact texture of regular life, the life I had fought, in ways I'd never fully described, to get back to. It wasn't like that, I said. Then what was it like? I could have said nothing. I was good at nothing. Silence had carried me through more difficult rooms than this one, but Tom had been beside me for 14 years, and he deserved better than a locked door. So I opened it, not all the way, just enough. I was a Blackhawk pilot first, I said. Then I commanded a small aviation rescue task force, overseas. He was quiet a moment. That sounds bigger than mostly flew helicopters. It was mostly helicopters. He didn't smile, neither did I. I thought about Fort Rucker before they changed the name, the heat rising off the tarmac like something alive, and being 24 and pretending not to be scared because everyone around me was pretending the same thing. Flight school teaches you machines. Combat teaches you people. You learn who panics quietly and who jokes to cover it, who needs a hand on the shoulder, who says I'm fine in a voice that means the opposite of fine. My first deployment changed something in the way I spoke. Not overnight, gradually, the way water shapes stone. I stopped confusing noise with strength. I stopped wasting words on things that didn't need saying. And then came the night that made the callsign permanent. I don't love telling it. There was a sandstorm, the kind that turns the world brown and removes the concept of visibility entirely. Communications kept fracturing. A small unit outside the safe perimeter had wounded men and no clean extraction route. The correct answer, professionally and procedurally, was to wait. Waiting was safe. Waiting was defensible. Waiting protected careers. Waiting meant men bleeding in the dark, while everyone covered themselves with paperwork. I made the call to go in. We went in twice. The second time, my own crew chief looked at me with an expression that said he thought I'd finally broken from reality. Maybe he was right. We brought people out. Not all of them. That's the part nobody includes when they call something heroic. They count who lived because it's easier than naming who didn't. The ones who didn't make it back have lived in the back of every room I've ever entered since that night. They always will. Tom listened without interrupting. When I stopped, he reached across and rested his hand on my knee. No squeeze, just weight, just presence. Why didn't you tell my family? Because then I become the story, I said. The uniform, the thing people either make too large or pick apart looking for cracks. What did you want to be? Your wife at dinner. He nodded slowly, quietly. Then, they weren't treating you like my wife, they were treating you like a punchline. I had no answer for that, because he was right. I washed my face that night and studied my hands under the bathroom light. Not old, exactly, just used. A small scar near my wrist from a maintenance accident that felt like another life. Another near my thumb from helping Dad fix his porch railing after he'd spent 45 minutes insisting he didn't need help, and then absolutely, completely needed help. Not all of it came from war. Some came from love, some came from stubbornness. Sometimes those are the same thing. My phone buzzed before I went to bed. Unknown number. Colonel Quinn, forgive the intrusion tonight. Some stories deserve silence, some deserve witnesses, your choice. Havoc. Frank Holloway. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I set the phone face down and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to Tom breathe beside me. Across town, though I didn't know it yet, Kevin Caldwell was awake at his kitchen table, typing my name into search bars. Maris Quinn Army, Maris Quinn Pilot, Havoc Blackhawk. He found almost nothing, and men like Kevin don't read silence as privacy, they read it as evidence. For about a week, the family stayed quiet. I should have known better. Men like Kevin don't release something once their pride has gotten tangled in it. The problem wasn't that a retired general had recognized me across a restaurant. The problem was that Kevin had watched an ent. Our table stop laughing at his joke, and then watched the same table fall completely silent when a man with 3 stars on his collar said my name with respect. That kind of moment doesn't leave a man like Kevin alone. The first signal came the following Sunday. Tom and I drove out to Diane's house in Madison for a family cookout. Hamburgers, potato salad, children destroying themselves in a sprinkler. The exact kind of Alabama afternoon that reminds you why you stay. My father declined. His knees were acting up, and he'd informed me that spending 2 hours around that loud insurance man qualified under his personal definition of a medical emergency. I couldn't argue. Kevin was under the patio umbrella when we arrived. Phone in hand, face wearing an expression I recognized, the look of someone who's been digging and hasn't found what they needed yet. He barely said hello. 40 minutes in, he tried. So Maris, he grinned, the grin with work behind it. I've been doing some reading. That's encouraging. A few people laughed. Kevin ignored them and kept going. He'd been searching my military background, not much out there. Found that strange, very mysterious. I took a long sip of iced tea and gave him exactly nothing. People like Kevin survive on reaction. Silence is starvation. He shifted, tried a different angle. How exactly had General Holloway known me? What kind of work? Why wasn't there more information? Small seeds planted carefully. Nothing large enough to confront directly, just enough to make people wonder. By sunset, I could feel the doubt moving through the family like a slow current. Not because anyone believed Kevin, because uncertainty is contagious, and Kevin was an expert at manufacturing it. Tom shook his head on the drive home. I can't believe him. I can. He spent the entire afternoon investigating you. He's investigating himself. I looked out at the passing headlights. He's trying to understand why a retired general knew my name and he didn't. Tom absorbed that. He doesn't actually care about your service record. No, I turned toward the window. He cares about being wrong. The digging didn't stop. It escalated. Diane called me one afternoon with the careful voice of someone delivering news they'd rather not. Kevin had apparently joined veteran Facebook groups. He'd been scouring archived military newsletters, old local newspaper databases, aviation reunion pages. The less he found, the more certain he became that something was being hidden from him. One evening, Tom turned his phone toward me in the kitchen. Family group chat. Kevin had posted, "Funny how some military stories get more mysterious when someone asks for proof." 3 laughing emojis underneath. Nobody had responded, not even Diane. Tom looked furious. I felt something quieter and heavier, tiredness. because I knew exactly what Kevin was engineering. The moment I started defending myself, he could reframe it as a debate. He could turn responding into proving, and the second you're proving something to someone who doesn't want to believe you, you've already lost the argument. I wasn't going to play. I drove to my father's house the following Tuesday. He was in his recliner, watching an old Western at a volume that constituted a public disturbance. "You're going deaf," I said. "I'm going old, same difference," he laughed. We watched cowboys gallop across landscapes no horse would ever voluntarily approach. Eventually, he struggled to stand the slow, negotiated process of a man bargaining with joints that have stopped honoring previous agreements. I moved toward him. He waved me off. Failed. Accepted the help. Once upright, he looked at me, a parent's look, the one that doesn't require words. "You okay?" That small pause was all it took. I told him everything. The restaurant, Holloway, the rumors, the cookout, Kevin's obsession. He listened the way Dad always listened, completely still, completely present. When I finished, he reached for his coffee mug. "You know what's funny? Tell me. You spent years flying into places that were actively trying to kill you." He set the mug down. "And one loudmouth at a barbecue gets further under your skin than enemy fire." I laughed despite myself, because it was true. After a moment, his expression settled into something simpler. The face he wore when he was about to say something he'd been carrying for a while. "People can only make you small if you hand them the ruler." That sentence followed me home. Kevin finally found what he believed was his smoking gun on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the waiting room of a physical therapy clinic while Dad worked through the exercises his doctor had prescribed and loudly resented. The therapist was 28 years old. Dad's primary complaint was that she kept calling him sir. I was halfway through a magazine I wasn't reading when the family group chat buzzed. Kevin had posted a photograph. Old, grainy, sun-bleached at the edges, the kind of image that has spent 20 years in a physical filing cabinet before someone fed it through a scanner and forgot about it. A younger version of me stood beside a Blackhawk. Flight suit, captain's bars, hair tucked under a helmet, a look on my face I barely recognized. Kevin's caption, "Found it. Looks like Maris really did fly helicopters." Still doesn't explain why people supposedly stood when she walked into a room. Then, a minute later, "Strange that this is the only photograph available. Almost like somebody wants the rest hidden." I put my phone down. Tom would later describe this phase as Kevin discovers the internet. What Kevin didn't understand was that the photo wasn't the story. The caption beneath it was. Captain Maris Quinn, Task Force Nightjar. Kevin's 19-year-old son, Mason, had zoomed in and read it. Then he asked the question his father never thought to ask seriously. "What's Task Force Nightjar?" Mason was smarter than Kevin realized. Unlike his father, he didn't search for confirmation of what he already believed. He just searched. 3 hours later, Mason posted a screenshot from an archived article. Most of it had been redacted into solid black bars. One sentence remained. Credited with preventing catastrophic loss of life during severe weather conditions. The group chat suddenly came alive. Diane responded. Cousins started asking questions. Kevin posted immediately, "Could be anybody." Mason answered, "Then why have you spent 2 weeks trying to prove it wasn't Aunt Maris?" I was in the waiting room when I read that. I laughed out loud. Several strangers looked over. I didn't care. Dad came shuffling back from his session, looking thoroughly victorious about something. The therapist behind him looked like she'd spent the last 45 minutes negotiating a ceasefire. "How'd it go?" "I survived, that's what matters." On the drive home, he noticed I was smiling. "Kevin found an old photo," I said. Dad rolled his eyes, kept his gaze on the road, a long pause. "You know what actually bothers him," he said eventually. "Tell me." "He needs there to be a trick." Dad shifted in his seat. "People like that are comfortable if somebody got lucky, comfortable if somebody lied, comfortable if somebody cheated their way to something impressive." Another pause. What they can't stand is somebody who earns something they don't understand. Several miles of Alabama highway passed between us. Dad was right. Kevin had stopped looking for facts. He was looking for an explanation that kept his own image intact. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. Maris, General Holloway. I straightened automatically. 15 years and the instinct was still faster than conscious thought. He'd heard about Kevin's informal investigation, something he described with the faintest trace of amusement as his own intelligence operation. Then his tone shifted, became the tone I remembered from briefing rooms. The Aviation Museum event was the following month, annual commemoration at Fort Novosel. I'd declined every invitation for years, every single one. Dale Wickham asked about you, Holloway said. I went still. Dale, one of the men from that night, one of the survivors. How was he? A pause, the kind people use when they're choosing honesty carefully. Not as well as he'd like. I looked out the kitchen window. The sun was sinking behind the tree line, long amber shadows moving slowly across the yard. He doesn't have many trips left in him, Holloway said quietly. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the darkening kitchen. Later, I drove to Dad's house. We sat on his porch with no television, no distractions, just crickets and fading light, and the slow breath of an Alabama evening. I told him about the call, about Dale, about the invitation. Dad listened. Then, slowly and with considerable negotiation with his joints, he stood. I watched the 30-second process of a man who refuses to be defeated by his own body, every second of it landing differently than it would have a year ago. Nobody gets unlimited tomorrows. Not Dale, not Dad, not me. He finally settled, rubbed his knees once, looked out at the yard. You going? I didn't answer. Sometimes, he said quietly, you don't show up for yourself. I looked at him. He shrugged. Sometimes you show up because somebody else needs you there. A week later, I called General Holloway. I was coming. Kevin heard about the event through Mason, and when Kevin learned I would be there, he decided to attend as well. He told the family he wanted to support us. What he actually wanted was to be present when the story finally collapsed, when the truth turned out to be smaller than everyone had begun to suspect. What Kevin didn't understand was that the truth had already been moving toward him for weeks. He just hadn't been reading the signs. The morning of the ceremony, I almost stayed home. I want to be honest about that, not the version where courage arrives cleanly and conviction carries the day. The real version, where I stood in my bedroom holding 2 dresses for 15 minutes while Tom adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror and quietly kept count of my outfit changes. That's 3, he said. Twice. 14 years of marriage, Maris. I know the difference between twice and 3 times. That got a genuine smile out of me, small but real. The U.S. Army Aviation Museum sits near Fort Novosel, and I hadn't been back for one of these events in years. Every invitation had lived briefly in a drawer before making its way to the trash. Not because I hated the people, because I'd needed the distance. There's a meaningful difference between those 2 things, and it had taken me a long time to understand it. Dad rode with us. His cane was wedged between the seats. The entire drive south he cycled through complaints about traffic, gas prices, road construction, and then traffic again. Some people perform serenity in old age. My father performs perpetual grievance and somehow makes it an act of love. The museum parking lot was filling when we arrived. Pickup trucks and SUVs and a few motorcycles. People moving carefully, the specific measured movement of people who have stopped taking their joints for granted. History visible in every shoulder, every careful step. I felt something tighten in my chest as we walked toward the entrance. Not fear, something closer to standing outside a room you've avoided for years, finally reaching for the door. Inside, photographs lining the walls, aircraft displays spreading across the polished floor, the smell of metal and old coffee, and something I couldn't name that smelled exactly like memory. General Holloway found us within minutes. He looked older than he had at the restaurant, not diminished, just further along. The difference matters enormously to people who have watched it up close. You came. I did. He looked at my father, extended a hand. Mr. Quinn. Dad took it, Frank. I stared at both of them. You know each other. Dad gave me the shrug of a man who's been keeping things from people his whole life as a matter of principle. We've had coffee. I didn't know how to respond to that. Somehow, it was the most perfectly logical thing I'd heard all year. The ceremony began just before noon. About 100 people gathered in the main hall. Families, veterans, museum staff, a handful of local reporters. Nothing staged or theatrical, just people choosing to remember together. I sat between Tom and Dad. Several rows behind us, Kevin had found a seat near the end of a row. His wife beside him, Mason on the other side. Kevin looked like a man who'd arrived at a party expecting to expose a magician and found himself surrounded by people who already knew how every trick worked. The program opened with introductions, unit recognitions, then stories, the kind that never appear in history books. An older veteran describing a friend he'd lost 40 years ago and still spoke to in his head, a widow sharing photographs, a grandson trying to reconstruct a grandfather he'd only known as a child. The room held all of it carefully. Then Holloway stepped to the podium. He didn't need volume to command a room. Some qualities survive retirement completely intact. He spoke briefly about service, about responsibility, about the difference between memory and honor. Then his eyes moved across the hall and found mine, and I knew, with the particular certainty that comes from knowing someone's decision-making process well, what was about to happen. 15 years ago, he said, a rescue operation took place under conditions most commanders would have declared impossible. The room drew inward. Many people contributed. Many people did extraordinary things. He paused. One officer made the specific decision that allowed a great number of young soldiers to have the opportunity to grow into old men. Silence. My chest was trying to climb out of my body. Maris Quinn. I stood. And the room rose with me. Every single person, veterans, families, museum staff, people I had never met in my life stood. The sound of chairs moving across the floor filled the hall like a slow wave. I froze. I was genuinely not prepared for that moment. I've been prepared for firefights. I've been prepared for equipment failures at altitude in darkness during a sandstorm. I was not prepared for that room full of people standing in silence because I walked into it. Tom was standing. Dad was standing, both hands gripping his cane, jaw set. Rows of veterans I didn't recognize were standing. And several rows behind all of them, Kevin was standing too, not performing it, not making a show, just standing. The silence lasted several long seconds. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. There was just the weight of people on their feet, and somehow that felt like more than either of those things. When I sat, my hands were shaking. The next speaker was Dale Wick. Come. I hadn't seen him in years. He walked with a cane now, slow, deliberate steps, his face carrying the specific weathering of a man who has spent a decade in conversation with pain and kept going anyway. He reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, found my face in the audience. Well, he said, this is awkward. Soft laughter moved through the room. He pointed at me, she hates this. More laughter, I covered my face with both hands. He wasn't wrong about any of it. Then his expression changed, not to sadness, not to drama, but to something simpler and more durable than either. I got to grow old, he said, because she flew back. No sentence in any speech that day came close to that one. He rested both hands on his cane, looked around the room at faces he'd known for decades. Getting old hurts, he said. Several veterans nearby laughed in recognition. Dale smiled. But it beats the alternative. The room laughed, then went quiet, because every person in that hall understood exactly what he meant. Dale sat down. The next speaker I wasn't expecting. Carol Sweeney walked to the podium carrying a framed photograph. A young man in uniform smiled from inside it. Her son Michael, 23 years old. Forever. She looked directly at me. You brought my son home. The room went completely still. Not alive. The words arrived gently, which made them harder to hold. But you brought him home. She lifted the photograph slightly. I got to bury my boy, I got answers, I got to stop wondering. Tears were already moving down my face. I didn't try to stop them. That matters more than people understand, Carol said. Then she looked at me one more time, with eyes that were kind in the specific exhausting way that comes from choosing kindness after the worst possible thing. Thank you. Half the room was crying. Dad was wiping his eyes with the back of his wrist, which he would absolutely deny for the rest of his life. A final veteran named Ray stood. Walked to the podium with a slight limp that he carried like old furniture, just part of the room now. He looked at me. You flew back into that storm twice. A pause. Nobody ordered the second trip. He sat down. That was the whole speech, 6 sentences, every one of them true. Holloway asked if I wanted to say a few words. I walked to the podium and looked out at the room, old friends, strangers, families holding photographs of people no longer present, people carrying things that hadn't healed and probably never fully would. I was doing my job. My voice came out smaller than I expected. I wish I could have done more. A breath. Every person on that ground mattered. Every person we brought home mattered. I swallowed. And the ones we couldn't reach, they've been in the back of every room I've entered since that night. Silence. Real silence. The kind you can't perform or purchase or manufacture. The kind that only arrives when something true has been spoken to people who understand exactly what it cost. I stepped away from the podium. As I returned to my seat, I heard Mason's voice, not loud, but clear enough to carry. Dad, he was looking at Kevin. Why did you keep saying she was lying? Several nearby heads turned. Kevin's face went red, his mouth opened, nothing came. General Holloway looked toward him from the podium, not with anger, not with contempt, with something more instructive than either. Son, he said quietly. Kevin looked up. Rank was never the impressive part. A pause. Responsibility was. Nobody added anything. Nobody needed to. The room had already done the work. The crowd stayed long after the ceremony ended. That always happens at events like this. The formal part finishes, and everyone discovers they're not ready to leave. Stories trade hands. Old names surface. People who haven't seen each other in a decade stand in corners laughing about things that absolutely were not funny when they happened. I shook hands and answered questions and hugged people I'd missed without quite admitting it. A few veterans wanted photographs. A grandmother introduced me to her grandson. Someone thanked me for my service in the careful voice people use when they mean it and can't find better words. I appreciated all of it. I was also profoundly, completely exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that isn't about sleep, that settles into the bones and asks for something deeper than rest. When the crowd began thinning, Tom drifted toward General Holloway near an aircraft display. Dad found a bench and sat in the specific way of a man who is done pretending his knees aren't reporting structural damage. I slipped outside. The Alabama afternoon had softened toward evening. Warm air, long shadows across the parking lot, a few veterans loading walkers into trunks, others saying goodbyes that kept extending the way goodbyes do when people aren't sure when they'll see each other again. I stood near Tom's truck and let myself breathe. It lasted 30s. Ekins. Maris. I turned. Kevin, standing several feet away, hands in his pockets, no drink in his hand, no audience behind him. Just Kevin, alone with himself in a parking lot, which appeared to be a situation he found genuinely uncomfortable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I didn't know, he said finally. I looked at him. You didn't ask. I did ask, he shifted his weight. You know I asked. You mocked. The words came out calm, just factual. There's a difference. Something in his expression moved. He looked at the pavement for a while. I thought you were making it up. He laughed once, short, quiet, the laugh of a man who has heard something absurd about himself and recognized it as true. The whole thing, the general, the rank, all of it, I kept thinking there had to be some explanation. I waited. There was, he said, then almost to himself, you were just telling the truth. The wind moved through the parking lot. Kevin looked toward the museum entrance, then back at me. You want to know what actually bothered me? I waited. When that general walked over, he stopped, started again. The whole table just changed how they were looking at you. He shook his head. Like they were seeing you for the first time, and I was sitting right there and I'd been, he stopped again. Making jokes, I said. Yeah, his jaw tightened. I hated that feeling. There it was, the actual thing, not helicopters, not military records, not rank or callsigns or retired generals. Just envy, ordinary, human, ugly, and finally named. So instead of sitting with that feeling, I said. Kevin winced, yeah. We stood in the quiet for a while. A truck engine started somewhere behind us. Normal sounds, the world continuing. I was wrong, Kevin said. I nodded. I kept it going longer than he stopped. Yeah, I was wrong. You weren't. He looked up, so what do we do now? I thought about it, not about what he deserved, about what was actually possible. I don't need you to admire me, I said. I genuinely don't, but I need you to stop making yourself taller by making other people smaller. I looked at him steadily. That's what it was, that's what it always was. Kevin held my gaze for a long moment, longer than I expected. Then he nodded. Fair. I almost left it there. But something in the way he was standing, like a man who wasn't sure whether he was forgiven or just reprimanded, made me add the rest. We can start over. He blinked, really. From respect, I said. Not from jokes, not from the story you've been building in your head, from actually seeing each other. He thought about that. I can do that. I know you can, I meant it. You raised a good kid. Mason asked you the right question today, that didn't come from nothing. Kevin made a sound that was mostly exhale. Tom appeared around the side of the truck, looked between us. His expression was the careful neutral of a man who has no idea what he's walked into and is proceeding cautiously. Everything okay? Yeah, Kevin said. He looked briefly at me, then at his brother. Yeah, we're good. Dad materialized a moment later, Kane first, expression already suspicious. What happened? Nothing, Kevin said. Dad narrowed his eyes with the precision of a man who has been detecting lies for 73 years. That's exactly what people say when something happened. Tom laughed. Kevin laughed. I laughed. And somehow it was easy, the specific effortless kind of easy that only arrives after something hard has finally been resolved. The drive back to Huntsville was quiet in the way that's comfortable rather than careful. Dad fell asleep before we reached the highway, his cane resting against the door, one hand folded across his stomach, his face doing the thing it only did when he wasn't performing for anyone. He looked older when he slept, more honestly old, the years sitting plainly on him in the way he wouldn't allow when he was awake and arguing with physical therapists and blaming his knees. Watching him, I thought about Dale at the podium, about Carol holding a photograph, about Holloway looking older in a way that had nothing to do with weakness, about all of them carrying things, invisible weight, old grief, the accumulated inventory of years spent somewhere difficult, doing something that mattered, and then coming home and trying to figure out who they were now. Growing older doesn't erase what you carried. It just teaches you how to carry it without letting it carry you. After we dropped Dad off, navigating the slow, careful ritual of getting him out of the truck and through his front door, without either of us acknowledging that I was helping, Tom and I drove the last stretch home in comfortable silence. We sat on the back porch after, full dark by then, crickets filling the yard, no television, no phones, no obligations. After a while, Tom nudged my shoulder. You okay? I thought about the question honestly, not the polite version, no. The quick reassurance. Really thought about it. The restaurant, Kevin's joke, the room that stopped laughing, a retired general standing up because he remembered my call sign, weeks of rumors moving through the family like weather, Dad on his porch saying people can only shrink you if you hand them the ruler, Dale at a podium saying I got to grow old because she came back, Carol with her photograph, a room full of strangers standing in silence. And Kevin in a parking lot, finally saying the actual thing. Yes, I said, I really am. Tom's hand found mine on the arm of the chair. I looked out into the Alabama dark and understood something I hadn't been able to see clearly until now. For years, I'd told myself I was protecting my peace by staying quiet, by keeping the story in a box, by showing up to family dinners as just Tom's wife, just Earl Quinn's daughter, just the woman in the corner who flew helicopters once. Maybe that was true for a while, maybe I needed that distance. But somewhere along the way, protecting my peace had become letting other people write my story, and that's a different thing entirely. Respect isn't a room standing up when you enter. It isn't a general saying your name in public. It isn't Kevin finally running out of jokes. It's the people who stay beside you when life asks hard questions. It's honesty offered without performance. It's a father on a porch saying sometimes you show up because somebody else needs you there. It's a husband who drives home with both hands on the wheel and waits until he has the right words. It's looking someone in the eye, even someone who's been trying to diminish you for months, and saying clearly, without cruelty, "You don't get to make me smaller anymore." That night I slept. Not because the past was gone, not because the weight had disappeared, but because I'd stopped spending energy on keeping a door locked that was always going to eventually open. The door was open now. And the room on the other side turned out to be full of people who were glad I'd finally walked through it. If this story stayed with you, I'd be grateful to know where you're listening from, and if there's a veteran in your life who deserves to be remembered, not just honored, but truly seen, feel free to share their name. Some people leave this world twice, once when they're gone, and once when we stop saying their name.